Hello and welcome to RC-750 Rehabilitation Counseling Research and Program Evaluation Week 3. This is Malachi Bishop with the Rehabilitation Counseling Program at the University of Kentucky, and this week we'll be talking about the research process, quantitative and qualitative research, and research designs. In section 1 of this week, we'll be talking about the research process, the process by which we go about developing, designing, and conducting research. So in terms of the research process, I like to think of this process as answering a question or telling a story. Basically, it's the process of saying, this is the question I want to answer, this is the way I went about answering it, this is what I found, and this is what it means. It's important to remember that the quality of the answer that you come up with depends on the manner in which we go about this process. And this is why we're spending time talking about this process in some detail. In week 1, we talked about the scientific method and identified that it was fallible. It's not perfect. But it is a better approach than many of the other ways of coming to know about the world that we learned about. The scientific method involves, as we said in week 1, following a series of organized and accepted steps to answering a question. And it's important that we follow the steps in terms of the process. We get the quality answer that leads to research that can be generalized for the profession. Step 1 in this process is to identify the research problem. And basically this can be a question that you want to answer, a thing that you would like to know more about, or it may be a theory that you want to test. A couple notes before we talk about the statement of the problem. I like to tell students who are working on research problems to remember to keep it simple. It's very rare that you will change the world with one study. It has been done in the course of history, but remember that your study is a single contribution to the broader picture. And so the process of actually doing the research and answering your question tends to lead to a narrowing and further narrowing of the problem until you get to a manageable study that you can do. And we'll see that a little bit later on in this section. So remember to keep it simple and based on your awareness of and review of the literature to see what has been done on your question, see what remains to be done, or you can do it in a different way. Ask yourself, in terms of this question, what has been done already, and can I do it differently? Can I come up with a different or better or another answer by answering this question in a different way? In terms of coming up with a statement of the problem, you might say to yourself, how can I add to this picture? Here's what we know, but here's what we still don't know, and I'm curious about this, so what can I do to add to our current understanding? Remember that you'll often find a statement of what research remains to be done in the research articles that you're reading. You'll find a statement, for example, like, it will be necessary to replicate these findings in a larger and more diverse sample. You'll find a statement like that sometimes in the conclusion of a research study. And those sorts of statements will give you ideas about what you could do in your research study to further answer this question. So things you can do in terms of coming up with a research study. You can test an existing theory or an original theory. You can come up with your own theory and test that. For example, we know that large employers are more willing to hire persons with disabilities, but there's a lot of reasons why that might be the case. You can come up with a theory about why that is true, and you could test your theory. You can replicate and extend existing findings. For example, there's been a lot of research done on disclosure of non-visible disabilities in the employment application process. Some studies have found that disclosing leads to a more positive outcome, and some studies have found that not disclosing leads to a more positive outcome. That's an open question that more research is needed on. So you can find a question like that and you can extend our current understanding. You can look at trends and changes over time. For example, we know that attitudes about HIV and AIDS have changed in the last 20 years fairly significantly. You can do a study to see how attitudes have changed among rehabilitation counselors. What are they now compared to what were they in a study that was done 10 years ago? You can check other people's findings using different approaches. So for example, let's say someone has done a study looking at veterans transitioning to post-service employment, and they did a quantitative study looking at the numbers. Maybe you do a qualitative study talking to veterans about their experiences in this transition. So you can look at the same question, but go about answering it a different way. And then you can develop a new and better intervention or treatment or instrument to measure some aspect of rehabilitation counseling. You might see, for example, that there's a need for a instrument or a measure in some area. You want to measure something and there's no instrument that exists to measure it. Or you might be interested in measuring social support or motivation among people with autism or intellectual disabilities or something like that. And you find and you're looking for an instrument that there isn't one that meets your need. So maybe you want to develop a new or better one. So there are a lot of things that you can do in coming up with a research problem. Once you've decided what the problem is that you want to tackle, the next step is to frame it in terms of a statement or hypothesis. And that means you want to frame it in terms of a testable statement or a question that you can answer. And research questions and hypotheses are testable questions or statements of theory. So before I talk a little bit more about hypotheses and research questions, let's look at what is a theory. Theory has been defined as an explanation of observed phenomena in terms of a system of constructs and laws that relate these constructs to each other. Another definition that I like better is that theories organize and integrate information that is already known into a meaningful framework, and then we can use that framework to make predictions. I mentioned the word construct in that first definition, and I wanted to make sure you're clear on the definition and meaning of that word, construct. Construct is defined as a generally understood idea. So it's an idea that we know. If you're talking to people, we all can understand what it is that we're talking about. We have a shared perception about what that means. So for example, if I say intelligence, you have some idea about what that means, and your idea is probably pretty much the same as my idea. So it's a common description shared by members of a field. But the idea is that this is a thing that cannot be directly sensed or perfectly measured. It has to be inferred from your behaviors. So if I observe your behaviors, I cannot see your intelligence. It's not something like your clothes that I can actually see with my eyes. I know it exists, and I know that you have intelligence, but I can't see your intelligence. So I have to infer your intelligence. I have to make decisions about your intelligence based on the way you behave. So we're not really measuring your intelligence, we're measuring the behaviors that reflect your intelligence. So a construct is an idea brought to a level of a shared perception, a common description shared by members of the field. All right, so we're talking about theory being a, let's go back and look at that definition. A theory is an explanation of observed phenomena in terms of a system of constructs and laws that relate these constructs to each other. For example, based on the observed phenomenon that many persons with psychiatric disorders are unemployed. That's something that we can observe. People with psychiatric disorders are less likely to be employed than people in the general population. Based on this observation, I might theorize that this is a consequence of the interaction of several constructs, or things that we know, such as I can understand from the research that employers have attitudes and expectations about good employees, about people they are likely to hire. They want these people to be predictable and reliable. We might also know from the research that people often have beliefs that persons with psychiatric disorders are unpredictable and unreliable. So we have two sets of known information, and from this put together a theory. We will form hypotheses or research questions that we want to study based on this theory. So a hypothesis is defined as a theory-based prediction about observed phenomena, and it is in the form of a testable statement of the expected relationship among the constructs. So a hypothesis is a statement that we can test about the relationship among the constructs. We might also frame our research as a research question. If you're not testing a hypothesis derived from a theory, then you can phrase the research problem in terms of a question. And this is generally not identified as frequently as hypotheses are. If you're reading a research article that's based on a hypothesis or a set of hypotheses, then generally the hypotheses will be listed in the research article that you're reading. Research questions are not always listed in the articles. They are often in vague and abstract terms, and may or may not be included in the article, but you can generally figure out what the research question is by reading the article. And we'll look at some examples. Based on my theory that the reason people with psychiatric conditions are less likely to be employed than the general population is that employers believe they will be unpredictable and unreliable employees. So that's based on the constructs or the known information. We've put together this system of beliefs, and we want to test these ideas, test this theory. We might test this theory with the hypothesis that, so this will be a statement that we can test. Employers believe persons with psychiatric disorders will be unpredictable and unreliable as employees. That's a statement that we can test that comes from the theory. We could also frame it in the form of a research question. Do employers believe that persons with psychiatric disorders are unpredictable and unreliable as employees? So that's something we want to know. We don't have information about this. This is a question we have, and so we just phrase it as a question about the information we would like to have. You should be aware that hypotheses may be stated in two forms, directional and null hypotheses. Directional hypotheses are statements about our expectations about what the research will show. So, for example, people who have a family member with a disability will have more positive attitudes toward people with disabilities. That's a statement, and it suggests a direction, an expectation about what the research will show. Null hypotheses are statements of no relationship. They state that no relationship exists, and this is not because this is what we expect to find in our results, but because of the way that inferential statistics work. And we'll be talking in a couple of weeks about inferential statistics, and we'll be talking about null hypotheses. But basically, what we try to do is reject the null hypothesis. We want to be able to say that the odds of these findings occurring are so small that the null hypothesis must be rejected, and therefore we would accept our directional hypothesis. But we'll get to that in a couple weeks. An example of a null hypothesis would be there is no relationship between having a family member with a disability and attitudes of people toward people with disabilities. Research questions, on the other hand, can take three forms. You can have descriptive or difference or relationship research questions. Descriptive research questions describe situations. They're asking what a phenomenon is like. For example, how do employers respond to disclosure of non-visible disabilities? That would be an example of a descriptive research question. We also have difference research questions where you're looking for finding out, is there a difference between two groups based on some variable of interest? So for example, do large employers respond differently from small employers? So two groups. Do large employers respond differently from small employers to the same disclosure, same type or level of disclosure? So here we're looking for a difference between two or more groups based on some variable of interest. And then relationship research questions explore the extent to which two or more constructs are related. Relationship between a variable and an outcome. So for example, how does the level of disclosure relate to whether a person is hired or not, or different outcomes? So remember, there are three forms that research questions can take. When we're talking about theories, I wanted to go ahead and point out that a theory can never be proven true. It can only be supported. Any result of a test of a theory can lead to any number of alternative and also supportable conclusions. So if we run a test of our theory and we find support for our theory, it's supportive, but it doesn't mean that there aren't other possibilities that would also support our theory. Remember that the soundness of theory is based on the total weight of the evidence over time. In other words, the more research support that exists over time, the more studies that are done that support the research theory, the more people start to put faith in it and believe in it, and eventually we end up with theories that the preponderance of people will accept. But we can never state absolutely that this theory is true, proven true. The ability of a single study to contribute to supporting the theory is limited or affected by issues such as the generalizability of the findings from the sample to the larger population, the operationalization of the constructs, and the methods that we use to assess the questions or hypotheses. And we'll be talking about some of those terms in just a couple minutes. If we consider our theory that employers are less likely to hire people with psychiatric disorders because they believe them to be unpredictable and unreliable as employees. Okay, let's say I test this theory by surveying 100 employers, and the way we go about testing this theory is by presenting pairs of descriptions of potential employees. One with a certain kind of disability, let's say, and one with a psychiatric condition. And we ask them to rate which one would be more likely to be reliable and predictable. And let's say we have all these pairs of people with different disabilities, and we show these and ask employers to rate the reliability and the predictability of all these different hypothetical people. And then we find, as a result of this research, that employers seem to believe that people with psychiatric conditions are less predictable and reliable than people with these other disabilities. So, have we proven our theory? We might have found support for our theory, but it doesn't prove our theory. It doesn't prove, for example, that employers are less likely to hire people with psychiatric disabilities because they find them unreliable and unpredictable. There might be a lot of other reasons that employers are less likely to hire people with psychiatric conditions that we didn't look at in this study. So again, other support could be out there. So we haven't proven that our theory is true. We have only supported it. And then the other part of that was that there can be methodological issues that make our findings more or less believable. For example, just to take an example to show you what I'm talking about, let's say those 100 employers that we surveyed, we found them at this employer convention, and that's where we drew our sample from. And they might have been more likely to have this belief about people with psychiatric conditions because they were all at this convention and they all watched this movie that depicted a person with schizophrenia as unreliable and unpredictable. So we have a very biased sample. So it's just an example of how methodology can make our findings maybe less credible, less supportive of our theory. So methodology is an issue. The way that we conduct our research, the process by which we conduct our research, decides really how effectively we answer our questions and how much support there will be for our answers. The third step is to design and conduct the research. So we're talking about the methodology. After you have your research question or hypothesis, next thing we do is define the variables involved in the study. We decide how we're going to measure them, and we think about how they might relate to each other. So first step is to define your definitions. Define your variables in terms of operational definitions. And I've used that word a couple of times now, and in case you're wondering what that means, operationalization means to define for the specific purpose of the research, to make the abstract concrete. So to operationalize is to define some construct for the specific purpose of the research. And we'll look at an example and you'll see what I'm talking about. Intelligence. That's a construct that can be defined in a great number of ways, right? It's a construct, so it's a fuzzy idea, and a lot of people could have different definitions of that. But for the purpose of our research, we have to come up with some way that we're going to define it and measure it. And so, for example, we might say, for the purpose of this study, intelligence will be defined and measured as the person's score on some intelligence test, like the ABC Intelligence Scale, or work satisfaction. Again, that's something that can be defined and measured in different ways, but for the purpose of doing a research study, we have to say, for this study, we operationalize work satisfaction as how many times people laugh and smile while they're at work. So we have operationalized work satisfaction for the specific purpose of this study. In our example, we would have to define and operationalize all the constructs that we talked about, like employers. What are employers? We would have to say employers for the purpose of this study will be human resource personnel in large businesses, and we would have to say large businesses. How are we going to define that? Over 250 employees. So you see what we've done is from the universe of employers, we've narrowed it down to human resource personnel in large businesses with over 250 employees. So remember at the beginning I said the process of conducting a research study often involves narrowing of our question into a manageable form. We would have to define psychiatric conditions. What does that term mean? And so we might identify specific psychiatric conditions that we're going to look at for this study. We have to define predictable and reliable. And we would have to figure out how we're going to measure those constructs too. So that's step 3, defining and figuring out how we're going to measure these variables. I also wanted to talk about thinking about how variables relate to each other as a part of this research process, and encourage you to think creatively about relationships between variables, and consider the potential importance of mediating and moderating variables. Mediating and moderating variables are something that you will probably have started to see in the research literature in the last few years if you've been paying attention, but increasingly in social sciences, statistical techniques and methods allow us to examine more complex relationships between the variables, including moderating and mediating variables, and multiple variables and how they interact. So because you will be seeing these terms, and I want to make sure you understand their meaning, let's talk about, define, and look at an example of each. A mediating variable explains the relationship between two other variables. In other words, the relationship between these two other variables exists only because of the mediating variable. We'll look at an example that will make that more clear. Moderating variables influence the relationship between two other variables, so they affect the direction or the strength of the relationship between two other variables. So let's look at the mediator variables first. And I'm going to show you potential relationship, and this comes from research that I do looking at psychosocial adaptation and the disability centrality model. And I'm going to start by showing you a direct relationship here, suggesting that having a disability or chronic illness affects quality of life. And there's research to suggest, for example, that people who have a person who has a disability or chronic illness has maybe lower quality of life than people who don't have a disability. And that's certainly not universally true, but when you look at large groups of people, you might find that relationship. So here we have two variables that appear to be related to each other. But what I'd suggest in my research is that the relationship is actually mediated by another variable, and this is the individual's experience and sense of control, experience with the disability, and their ability to control the impact of the disability in different areas of their life. So the impact of disability on quality of life is said to result not from the fact of the disability, not the fact that the disability exists, doesn't directly affect quality of life, but rather the way that the person experiences the disability, the extent to which the disability or chronic illness may create a loss of opportunities to obtain satisfying outcomes or to participate in enjoyable activities, things like that, or the inability to control outcomes and to make things different, to engage in more enjoyable activities or to obtain more satisfying outcomes. It's that experience of the disability that actually creates the relationship. So rather than the relationship existing between disability and quality of life, we're now saying because of this mediator variable, we're actually saying this relationship only exists through the mediator variable. There is no relationship between disability and quality of life except through the variable of the person's experience. Let's look at an example of a moderator variable. This one's a little different. Let's say that there has been found to be a relationship between one's intelligence and one's performance on math tests. That sort of makes sense. There probably is a relationship like that. I don't know, but let's say we're thinking about middle school students and this relationship. And let's say, and I'm not necessarily saying this is just hypothetical, but let's say that we also know that females tend to score better on math tests than males. So now we have another variable that influences that initial relationship. So intelligence does affect math scores. It may predict math scores, but if you throw in gender, then that whether a person is male or female actually can make that relationship stronger or weaker. So this additional variable of gender makes that relationship stronger. That would be a moderating variable. The relationship exists. It doesn't exist because of this variable, but this variable makes the relationship stronger or weaker. So that would be an example of a moderator variable. In this step 3, you also have to consider some other methodological issues. We have to, for example, identify the population that we're going to study. We have to think about where we're going to access these people, or where we're going to observe these people, who are the people that are going to be participating in the study. And then we have to identify the appropriate design. The design is something we'll be talking about in the next section, but we also have to think about methods of data collection. Are we going to use surveys? Are we going to observe people? We're going to watch them. We're going to observe them with cameras, things like that. So how are we going to collect the data? And then what instruments are we going to use? Are we going to use existing instruments? Are we going to create new measures, new ways of measuring people? What statistics are we going to use to perform our analysis, and so on? So all these sorts of methodological issues have to be considered in our just thinking about conducting and designing the research. And then in the concluding slide here, steps 4 and 5 combined. They include testing the hypothesis and actually conducting the analysis, and doing the analysis and see what the results are. And then step 5, interpreting the results, and I included also presenting the results. And that's where we ask, what do these results mean in terms of the research question or the goal of the research? Here's what we found. What does this mean in terms of the big picture of what we were trying to find out? Does this support the theory? Does this answer the question? What does this contribute to the knowledge base? We talk about what are the limitations. Because of the way we did this study, because we had a sample of 100 employers who all watched the same movie, that's a limitation. Because of where we did the study, how we did the study, there are some limitations to generalizing this knowledge, generalizing these results. And part of interpreting and presenting the results is identifying those limitations. And then we also talk about what's next. We've come up with an answer, but maybe we need to see if this study would find the same answer with a different group of people. Maybe we've answered this part of the question, but now we need to answer this other part of the question. So where do we go from here? And then you have completed your research study, and this completes section 1 of week 3.